USS Wisconsin is a beautiful and legendary warship that entered service after the traditional role of the battleship had evolved. Built to slug it out with ships of the line such as herself, Wisconsin, or Big Whisky as she's affectionately known, instead found herself protecting the vitally important carriers of the U.S. fleet off the coast of Japan during the final year of the Pacific War. She then spent the rest of her career providing accurate and dependable gunfire support whenever she was called upon, and now she resides on the waterfront in downtown Norfolk as a museum ship open to the public. Wisconsin's keel was laid down on January 25, 1941, at the Philadelphia Naval Yard, and she was launched almost 3 years later on the second anniversary of the attack on Pearl Harbor. Despite having a higher hull number and being laid down after her sister Missouri, she was actually launched and commissioned ahead of her. She had an overall length of 887 feet, a beam of 108 feet, and her standard displacement at the time of her commissioning was 45,000 tons. Big Whisky's main battery consisted of 9 16-inch 50 caliber guns, which carried the model number Mark 7 and were designed specifically for the Iowa class. These were housed in 3 3-gun turrets that were arranged in the classic 2-in-1 configuration that was standard on all of the USN fast battleships. Each barrel could be elevated and fired independently, and was capable of hurling a 2,700-pound armor-piercing shell almost 42,000 yards or about 24 miles at an elevation of 45 degrees. At this elevation and distance, her shells were in the air for over 90 seconds before they hit home, and a well-trained gun crew could get off 2 rounds per barrel per minute. Wisconsin's secondary battery consisted of 20 of the highly effective and versatile 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, which were located amidships in 10 twin-barreled turrets. She had 5 of these mounts on each broadside. Her light anti-aircraft battery included 20 quadruple 40mm Bofors mounts, along with 49 single-mount 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Wisconsin was equipped with an SK-2 air search radar and 2 SG surface search sets. She had a pair of Mark 38 gun directors with Mark 8 fire control radars on top to direct her main battery, and 4 Mark 37 directors with Mark 12 and Mark 22 radars which directed her secondary battery. Her Quad 40s were remotely controlled by a director that was usually located behind the mount and incorporated a Mark 14 lead computing gyro gun sight, while the sailors who manned Oerlikons used the Mark 14 sight to manually track their targets. Wisconsin was protected using the all-or-nothing armor scheme, as was standard on all U.S. battleships after the introduction of Nevada in 1916. Her main armor belt is 12.1 inches thick at her waterline and tapers down to 1.62 inches where it meets her triple bottom. Her belt is internal and sloped at 19 degrees, which gives her armored citadel protection equivalent to 17.3 inches of armor at 19,000 yards against 16-inch 45 caliber guns. She was also designed to have full immunity against plunging fire between 18,000 and 30,000 yards from the same weapons. She was a rugged and well-protected ship. Wisconsin was powered by 4 geared steam turbines. Her steam was provided by 8 oil-fired boilers, and each turbine drove 1 propeller shaft. She was rated for 212,000 shaft horsepower. This produced a top speed of 32.5 knots at normal displacement. Wisconsin had a cruising range of 15,000 nautical miles at a speed of 15 knots. She had 2 aircraft catapults located on her stern and was manned by 2,700 officers and enlisted men when she entered service in 1944. Wisconsin was commissioned into the fleet on April 16, 1944, and immediately began ramping up for war. After her sea trials, she got underway for the British West Indies to conduct her shakedown cruise. Upon the completion of her final speed trials at the end of September, she got underway for the Pacific. She spent most of October and November training in Hawaiian waters, before departing Pearl Harbor on December 1st, finally bound for the combat zone. Wisconsin arrived at Ulithi on December 9th and was added to Task Group 38.2 of the Fast Carrier Task Force. Her new task group was filled with some heavy hitters, as both the task force commander, Vice Admiral John McCain, and 3rd Fleet's boss, Admiral William Halsey, were embarked within the group. Among her new charges were the fleet carriers Lexington and Hancock, and her sister New Jersey was also assigned to the task group. From December 14th through the 16th, Wisconsin's task group supported amphibious landings on the island of Mindoro by conducting carrier strikes throughout the greater Manila area. Naval aviators quickly won air supremacy, while Wisconsin faithfully screened her charges. Wisconsin then rode out Typhoon Cobra on the 17th with the rest of Task Force 38 before retiring to Ulithi, where she spent Christmas. The new year found her at sea conducting exercises with the other fast battleships of Vice Admiral Willis Lee's Task Force 34. From January 3rd to the 22nd, she returned to carrier escort duty as the Fast Carrier Task Force conducted airstrikes against Formosa, Luzon, and the Nansei Shoto Islands. Task Force 38 also entered the South China Sea during this time to strike targets in French Indochina. On the 12th, Wisconsin's task group was dispatched and directed to close on the Indochinese coast. Wisconsin, New Jersey, and 5 cruisers were ordered to bombard targets inside Cam Ranh Bay, but their mission was canceled as intelligence indicated their primary targets, the Japanese hybrid battleships Issei and Hyuga, were no longer present in the bay. Wisconsin screened the carriers as the fleet struck Tokyo for the first time on February 16th. As carrier planes pummeled targets around the Japanese capital, Wisconsin and her group stood a mere 120 miles southeast of it, totally unopposed. The fleet then steamed to support the Marine landings on Iwo Jima before making more strikes on Tokyo on the 25th. On March 4th, Wisconsin entered Ulithi, and preparations for the upcoming invasion of Okinawa began. Wisconsin's group stood out on March 14th and headed towards the Japanese home islands. Here, she warded off numerous air attacks, both of the conventional and kamikaze variety, as she screened the carriers. On the 24th, in company with her sisters New Jersey and Missouri, she bombarded Japanese installations on the southeastern coast of Okinawa. Wisconsin would spend the next 6 weeks operating off the Okinawan coast, helping to protect the fleet's carriers from the ever-constant kamikaze threat. Wisconsin arrived back at Ulithi on May 14th to replenish and was underway again on the 24th. During the final week of May and into June, she operated with Iowa, Missouri, and the large cruisers Alaska and Guam southeast of Okinawa. She rode out a typhoon on June 4th and 5th, and on June 8th her float plane rescued a downed aviator. After a brief stay for rest and replenishment at Leyte, Wisconsin once again found herself off the coast of Japan screening the carriers as they conducted strikes in the Tokyo area on July 9th. On the 15th, Wisconsin, Iowa, and Missouri, along with 2 cruisers and 9 destroyers, bombarded the steel mills and oil refineries at Muroran, Hokkaido. She then conducted a night bombardment on the 17th in conjunction with Iowa, Missouri, Alabama, and North Carolina. Together, the battle wagons hit the industrial facilities in the Hitachi-Miro area northeast of Tokyo. She spent the final weeks of the war screening her carriers as they relentlessly struck the home islands. Wisconsin entered Tokyo Bay on September 5th and shifted to Okinawa on the 22nd, where she embarked homeward-bound servicemen as part of Operation Magic Carpet. She arrived in San Francisco in mid-October and participated in Navy Day celebrations while there. By mid-January, she was back on the eastern seaboard where she was overhauled in mid-1946. She was then used as a training ship for most of 1947. In January 1948, she reported to the Atlantic Reserve Fleet at Norfolk for inactivation and was formally placed out of commission on July 1st. She was not a part of the mothball fleet for very long, though, as she was recommissioned on March 3, 1951, to counter communist aggression on the Korean Peninsula. In late October, Wisconsin once again departed for combat in the Pacific. She relieved New Jersey as flagship of the 7th Fleet on November 21st, and 5 days later she departed Japan for Korean waters. On December 2nd, she left the carrier task force and settled into the role for which she came out of the mothballs for seaborne gunfire support. Her first business opportunity came in the Kosong area, where she supported the 1st Marine Division until mid-December. Her accurate 16-inch fire took out numerous enemy bunkers, artillery positions, trenches, and troop concentrations. She retired to Yokosuka, Japan on the 31st for a week of rest and replenishment. Wisconsin headed for Korean waters once again in early January. She entertained the President of South Korea and his wife on the 10th before heading back to the gun line on the 11th. Her primary targets were the same as before. Throughout January and February, she provided fire support up and down the east coast of the Korean peninsula as needed. She took out numerous enemy positions over this period, including several bridges and even a small shipyard before departing for Yokosuka at the end of the month. She got back into the thick of things on March 15, 1952, off Songjin, Korea. Early that morning, she destroyed a train. Then, in the afternoon, she received her first and only direct hit of her career, when a communist shore battery struck the splinter shield of a starboard 40mm gun mount. 3 sailors were injured, and Wisconsin's gunnery department, obviously agitated, responded by barking out a full 9-gun salvo from her main battery, which completely destroyed the North Korean battery. In response, an escorting destroyer supposedly used a blinker light to jokingly signal temper temper at the battle wagon. Although this incident lacks extensive corroborating evidence aside from crew members who told the tale of it, the episode remains a captivating anecdote from Wisconsin's time off the Korean coast. Wisconsin was relieved by Iowa on March 19th, and she arrived at Norfolk near the end of April after having visited Guam, Hawaii, and California on her way home. She spent the next year conducting training cruises and exercises before being overhauled and sent back to the Pacific in September of 1953. Upon her arrival, Wisconsin relieved New Jersey as the flagship of 7th Fleet and would function in this role until April 1, 1954. On June 7th, as she neared the end of her trip home and entered the Virginia Capes operating area, she was met by her 3 sisters. The Iowa sisters then proceeded to maneuver and frolic throughout the area for several hours in what would be the only occasion that all 4 of them were ever photographed operating together. Over the next 2 years, she split time between midshipman cruises and fleet exercises. On May 6, 1956, while operating off the Virginia Capes, she collided with the destroyer USS Eaton in heavy fog. Wisconsin received extensive damage to her bow, while Eaton was almost cut in 2 and had her keel broken. Thankfully, only 1 sailor was injured in the mishap, and the commander of Eaton was court-martialed after being found negligent. Wisconsin promptly entered the dry dock at Norfolk for repairs, and in a magnificent feat of engineering, a 68-foot-long, 120-ton section from the incomplete Iowa-class battleship Kentucky was transported by barge from the Newport News to Norfolk, and working around the clock, shipyard workers were able to effect repairs in a mere 16 days. But Wisconsin's days in the active fleet were numbered, and on March 8, 1958, she was placed out of commission. This left the United States Navy without an active battleship for the first time since 1895. Wisconsin was towed to the Philadelphia Navy Yard in 1962 and sat along the Philadelphia waterfront next to her sister Iowa for the next 28 years until she was reactivated on August 1, 1986, and towed to New Orleans for dry dock work. She then moved to Pascagoula, Mississippi for a complete overhaul and modernization. Her remaining World War II-era AA mounts were removed, along with 4 of her 5-inch turrets, the ones located directly amidships on both broadsides, and the 2 furthest aft on each broadside. She was equipped with new weapon systems, including Harpoon and Tomahawk missile launchers, and 4 Phalanx 20mm Gatling guns. She had her radar, fire control systems, and electronic warfare capabilities all modernized as well. Wisconsin was recommissioned at Pascagoula on October 22, 1988, and then spent the rest of the year at Norfolk before returning to Mississippi in early January to complete her fitting out. She spent the rest of 1989 training and working up in the Atlantic, before heading back to the Gulf of Mexico to conduct sea trials in early December. She conducted training and took part in a fleet exercise during the first half of 1990, before getting underway on August 7th for her first deployment in more than 30 years. Her battle group arrived in the Persian Gulf on the 23rd. Through December, Wisconsin's leadership was actively involved in planning, both ashore and afloat, that put together the procedure and plans to support naval operations should hostilities in the region begin, which included the planning of Tomahawk strikes and naval gunfire support. In an effort to lighten the mood of the fleet around the holidays, Wisconsin hosted the first ever Persian Gulf Sports Festival on her fantail. Athletes from 6 ships and 1 shore command competed in various competitions, which included boxing, wrestling, and weightlifting, as well as a talent show. On January 13th, Wisconsin got underway from Bahrain in anticipation of the start of offensive operations. Acting as the Tomahawk strike commander for the Persian Gulf, she directed the Tomahawk launches that initiated the opening of hostilities of the Gulf War on January 17th. Wisconsin's 8 missiles were included in the total of 47 Tomahawks fired in the initial volley, and over the next 2 days, she fired a total of 24 Tomahawks altogether. As the aerial bombing campaign ramped up, Wisconsin became the logistical and personnel transportation hub for the Persian Gulf. By receiving passengers, cargo, and mail bound for all of the ships in the northern Persian Gulf, she greatly reduced the burden on the logistics support infrastructure. In all, she transferred over 40,000 pounds of mail, 20,000 pounds of cargo, and 140 personnel during this time period. On February 6th, Wisconsin relieved her sister Missouri on the gun line near the Kuwait border. Her first fire mission of the war, which was her first in 39 years, came shortly after her arrival on station. Wisconsin promptly destroyed an enemy artillery emplacement. Over the next several days, she used her guns against communications facilities, artillery batteries, command posts, bunkers, small boats, and even a mechanized unit. She retired to the central Persian Gulf on the 9th to replenish and resume her logistics role. Wisconsin returned to the gun line on February 21st and began the day with a bang as she fired 50 16-inch rounds into a command complex, completely destroying 10 structures that housed troops and communications. On the 24th, she barked out 94 rounds with devastating effect on several infantry and artillery positions. She shifted to on-call fire support for the coalition forces ashore that day, and during 2 such fire missions, she quickly suppressed resistance at 2 bunker complexes. She repositioned herself on the 26th, and on the 28th, fired her last 16-inch shells of the war. She remained on station for another week while coalition ground forces entered and secured Kuwait City. On March 1st, her drone flew over Failaka Island and observed hundreds of Iraqi troops waving white flags, which was the first recorded instance of surrender to an unmanned aircraft. She arrived in Norfolk at the end of March and was decommissioned for the 3rd and final time on September 30th, 1991, once again joining the Atlantic Reserve Fleet. In December 2000, she was towed and berthed on the waterfront in Norfolk. She was opened to the public in April 2001, but was still owned by the Navy and was still considered part of the mothball fleet. However, Wisconsin was almost 60 years old, and even with her 1988 modernization, she was obsolete. With the cost of reactivating her estimated to be near $500 million and $1.5 billion to fully modernize her, the Secretary of the Navy struck Wisconsin from the Naval Vessel Register, clearing the way for her to be a full-fledged museum ship. The U.S. Navy officially transferred Wisconsin to the city of Norfolk in 2009, thus ending the requirements for the ship to be preserved for possible recall to active duty. A formal ceremony transferring the ship to the city of Norfolk took place on the 66th anniversary of her commissioning in April 2010, and she was listed on the National Register of Historic Places in March 2012. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe so that we can bring you more content like this.